You've done this before, I assume.
Yep. I have a whole setup down here. I've been trying to fix the setup upstairs because my wife works downstairs. I generally work upstairs, but it's like I said, it's darker upstairs because we tinted the windows so it won't be so hot in the morning.
Yeah.
So trying to figure that out.
The drag of living in a...
When we did it, we weren't planning on COVID-19 being a...
Recording. Just so I have it on tape, your name, please.
Javon Johnson, Javon Johnson, Assistant Professor and Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies at UNLV.
Good deal. I guess the first question is about the broadest one I could think of. It's been weeks now since these protests began, the Black Lives Matter protests since George Floyd's death. How would you characterize the response nationwide and the action or lack thereof at the core issue of policing and civil rights?
So I'm going to have you ask that one more time. And the reason I am is because I forgot to put this on Do Not Disturb. And so we're going to get all of the, I get a lot of emails. And so I just wanted to not have that boom in the middle of me speaking. So sorry about that.
You're all good. It's okay. You're a popular man. I understand. So I'll ask again, your perspective on the protests that have been going on for several weeks, the Black Lives Matter protests here nationwide, and the response from lawmakers, from communities to the issue, the core issues of civil rights, of police activity and use of force, and what has brought us to this point in the last month or so.
So what are my general feelings about that is sort of the question, I think.
Yeah, just kind of broadly.
Yeah, I think what I'm mostly sort of proud of, I'm one of those people that that refuses to reduce politics to lawmakers and voting, right? But recognize the importance of sort of that location of lawmaking and voting. And one of the things that I think is really important to remember is the ways in which young activists have really sort of pushed the needle in this country in terms of conversation. I am really excited and hopeful for their work and where they're pushing, our discussions and where this country should go. And I think that's a really important thing to always sort of remember, right? That we think a lot about lawmaking, we think a lot about policy, but we don't always talk enough in these sort of moments, in these sort of, kinds of interviews about the work on the ground that people are doing that are forcing lawmakers to have conversations, right? It's not like these sort of law and policy makers were out of nowhere, one day having coffee and saying, you know what, we should extend rights. Often what happens are people are fighting, they're yelling, they're screaming, they're disrupting, they are in city council, they are demanding, because one of the other things that we kind of fail to realize is that a lot of these agitators, these protesters, are beautiful and brilliant organizers who are often in city council, who are often demanding things from the local. Like, one of the big important things about Black Lives Matter as an organization, if you go on their website, they are pushing for folks to think locally, to get involved locally, to demand locally. So I think about these protests in that sense, right? In the idea that they are pushing the needle, that they are demanding the conversation, that they are forcing our lawmakers to have conversations that 6 months ago I didn't think I would see right now, right? And these conversations in some areas obviously have been better than others, right? And certain lawmakers and policymakers have been more responsive than others, right? And these conversations have been all across the board, from not only the removal of Confederacy and colonial iconography and symbolism, but also in laws that are around protecting, but also in a conversation about police abolishment, about prison abolishment, about police defunding, about prison defunding. And we've moved the conversation, or at least those young scholars and activists have moved the conversation from reform to thinking about defund and abolishment, and that's their work, right? To force us to imagine a new world.
And the conversations and the issues with regarding, and we'll get to the issues of the Confederate statues and all of that in a second. But when we talk about issues of policing, issues of civil rights, of excessive use of force by police departments nationwide, and the inherent issues on that, I've covered stories on that for 15, 20 years in various cities and here in Las Vegas. Why is now this, has the spark actually lit the fire?
I think there's a number of different things, right? I think that video in particular of George Floyd and the officer kneeling on the neck so callously is hard to watch. I don't watch the videos. I've seen enough to know what happens, but I have saw moments, I have saw images of that video, and it's hard to believe that that person was doing anything close to law enforcement. Couple that with the fact that it took them a while to even indict, to even arrest, to bring on charges, lets us know that the state doesn't care about Black life in the ways in which Black people need the state to care about Black life, right? You watch that video, had it been a non-officer, it would have been no question he or she would have been taken, or they would have been taken to jail immediately and arrested immediately. Couple that with the fact that we had just lost Breonna Taylor, right? Who was murdered while sleeping in her home. And I don't want to forget that. And those cops are still, by and large, not held accountable. Couple that with the fact that we just finally saw the videos of Aubrey, right? Couple that with the fact that we finally saw the videos of Ahmaud Arbery, right? Couple that with the fact that we literally have witnessed a long strain of these videos, and it's been hard to watch and difficult to deal with. Couple that with the fact that people are at home because of COVID-19. Right? And they have time, and they have a lot of time to not only get out in the streets, but also research and new possibilities for the world that we want to live in. Couple that with the fact that people begin to lose their housing, people begin to lose their jobs, which means they lose their health care, because in this country, we tie health care to employment, which is also beyond bonkers, especially in a moment of pandemics that forces people to lose jobs at a moment we need people to have health care. Couple that with the fact that people are frustrated watching billionaires get richer, watch politicians not respond. Couple that with the fact, like, all of this stuff come together. People are also frustrated with Donald Trump in many kinds of ways, right? Him acting as him using his dog whistle every time something racial, gendered, sexed is mentioned, him not responding to COVID-19 in a certain kind of way. So it's been a series of different things that all came together in this moment that said, okay, enough's enough. And then add to that, when people are protesting police violence, the police responded with police violence. 100+ people have been murdered by the police in the last 20 days.
In the U.S.?
That's in the U.S. That's bonkers.
Real quick, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to, I'm a little nervous that this is going to close out because Zoom is weird that way. I just don't want to have this suddenly shut itself off. So bear with me for a split second here. Somewhere I'll figure that out. All right, cool. Yeah, so that gets to the idea of the spark. This is all sort of percolating underneath, and the spark. But what's interesting is also there has been an effort for so long in the Southeast especially to get rid of the Confederate flag, the statues for various Confederate Army leaders and names of bases. And now they're just getting taken down. What does that represent to African American life, history, and culture to finally see not all, but a fair chunk of these symbols taken down? Or does it, or is it just? Well, I'll let you finish. Sorry.
I mean, that's a large question, and I think there's a number of ways I could probably answer that. First is, it's hard for me to speak for all Black folk,
No,
right?
I understand that. I understand
Uh, I imagine for some of us, it's a beautiful thing. I imagine that for some of us, we're still skeptical, and rightfully so, right? History has taught us to be skeptical. A dying thing rarely goes away calmly, right? And so I know that for some of us, we are concerned about what are the responses, right? Um, um, I think it represents a turn in history for some of us. And then it also represents possibilities for a new future, a new world, right? One that recognizes in a much larger capacity, the ways in which racism is so deeply stitched and deeply knotted in the fabric of America that it is no longer enough for us to say, no, it's not, that we now have to start doing things about that. And symbolism is one step, right? That's one step. It is not the end all be all, right? It is one thing to remove a statue. It is another thing to remove the laws, the policies, the rules that govern and maintain racism as a practice in this country. And that's going to be a long fight. And that is also the beginning. That is also a part of this, right? That this is only one part, and albeit a small but necessary part.
I don't know if you can address this. UNLV removed Hey Reb last night, kind of under the cover of darkness a little bit. The university mentioned it had some conversations with members of the community, I assume members of the faculty. I'm curious if you had any of those conversations, either with the president or anyone else, or if you were as surprised as everyone else that they took it away.
I've had some conversations.
So what, tell me about the conversations.
I don't want to necessarily speak on those conversations, but I can tell you my feelings, right? I have no problem telling you my feelings, right? We've had conversations, and I think it is also important to mention, I'm not necessarily, I guess the best way for me to explain it is my feelings are my feelings in and outside of those conversations. And I think that will probably be a better sort of answer to this, right? Than to spill out conversations that I have with my bosses. Right?
No, I understand that, but I don't want to jeopardize that. I guess. Well, let's get to start from the beginning. When did these conversations start? And what does Hey Reb represent for you?
So, my personal conversations have been for a couple years now, right? But I do think it's also important to remember that folks have been having this conversation for at least as long as I can remember, maybe the 70s, right? But I was talking to a reporter earlier who sort of mentioned, the petition that came out. And he really wanted to know who created the petition. And one of the things that I pushed back on is I refused to tell him who actually created it, right? Because there was a collective of people, right? And that was my thing. I think part of what happens is we want to know what was the spark that did it. And that's an easy story to tell, but I think it misses the point. The point is that it was a series of things, a long fought battle. And I know that's a much more difficult and boring story to tell, but Black students in the 70s fought against this, right? We must not forget that. We must not forget that they were some of the earliest, if not the first group to say enough's enough. This can't be. It has clear Confederate ties, right? And I imagine you've done some of the research on that, right? That we use Confederate colors, right? That the original mascot was Beauregard, named after General Beauregard of the Confederate Army. That Confederate flags were on the newspaper, and that I believe that the original helmets of the football team, right? That there is really no way around getting away from it. That even if you tried to make the argument that it's about pioneer mountain men going West, I would respond with, well, that sounds a lot like Manifest Destiny for me, and the uprooting and the upheaval of indigenous people's lives whose land we're currently on right now, which brings me to my next point. Indigenous students have been fighting for this for decades as well, right? Because you can't give them that narrative and expect them not to push back on that, right? And so you've had long groups of people that have been fighting for this for quite some time, and I think that's the more natural narrative and the actual more honest narrative. And I think with that being said, I want to divert attention away from me, right? Which is why I was like, I've had conversations, I don't also want to speak about them. What becomes important too is the long, robust history and the amount of people who have fought against this. And equally important, what must be said here is that this moment, whatever happens in this moment, was made possible because of those moments before. I also think the taking down of the statue is not also separate from the fact that we are, as you said earlier, taking down colonial and Confederate iconography across the country. We're taking down racist iconography and colonial iconography across the world, actually, right? We just recently saw Ghana get rid of the Gandhi statue in front of its university, right? Because Gandhi had some very questionable things he said about Africans, right? And I think this is all a part of that, right? My feelings is that it's a deeply, deeply, deeply rooted symbol attached to the Confederacy, and we cannot dismiss that.
And the only reason I asked you about your conversations is only because in the university's statement, the president said that she had conversations with the community, and so my thought was just, well,
no, I understand. And what also, no. And what also must be said, I'm also not a person that's like, I'm not afraid of a lot of things. Things happen, they happen, whatever, right? But the point is, I think it's also important to be mindful that the administration listened this time, right? And that is important too, because they didn't in the past.
And I don't know if you can address this, but the President Mian also suggested that there was more to come. The statue's gone, but the name remains. Do you think that's going to stay the case? Or do
My hope is that the name changes.
Say, I interrupted you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can finish the question.
I was going to say, the statue's gone, the name remains. Do you think that will stay that way?
My hope is that it won't. The small bit of optimist that exists in me thinks it won't. The skeptic in me is always worried. But I think and my hope is that it will change, that there are ongoing conversations, and that name changing is not a new thing. We've witnessed it across the country, right? And we cannot, rest on the fact that this is always how it, this is how it always been, because a lot of things have always been a way, and that doesn't necessarily make it correct, right? I think, like I said, my hope is that it will change. How long will it take? I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do know that there is still a growing group of people, and that number is growing every day, that are voicing out that this enough's enough, and we ought to change that. I mean, look, we could also pick a mascot that is uniquely tied to Vegas. We could be the Rams. I mean, we're Battle-born city, for God's sake, right? We could be the wild Mustangs that exist out there. I mean, we could pick things that are uniquely attached to this city, right? Maybe the cacti for all I care, right? But the point is that we have options, right? And that we can make that change. And I have a strong belief, right? Because I believe that this administration will do well, and I have a strong belief that we're listening, and we're going to make some changes, and it's my hope that will happen.
Okay. I could talk to you for a long time. There's obviously a lot of other issues about the issues. There's a lot of other issues going on right now, but I think I might leave it at that for now. Is there anything else you wanted to address regarding chiefly the idea of symbolism, but I broadly here in Las Vegas, what we're seeing on the streets, the efforts by organizers in civil rights and Black Lives Matter protesters to activate some change here in town?
Yeah, I'm also proud of that work. I'm meeting more and more activists, just had some Zoom meetings like with 3 different groups yesterday. So I'm energetic. I'm excited. I'm exhausted, but I'm excited nonetheless. Um, I'll say this, and this is both locally, but it's also nationally. I get that change is scary and people are like, well, what are we going to do? And I think my response has always been change allows us to rebuild in a new way, right? I, I think about getting rid of a thing allows us to put something back in its place, right? And that's really, really important to think about, right? So as one like myself who might advocate the abolishment of police, defund and abolishment, and same with prisons, when people go, well, what are we going to do with the most violent people? My response is, I think you're starting from a failed place. One, and I do think two, this gives us an opportunity to think about how not to have the most violent people in the world. What other options are out there, right? We do recognize that prison isn't solving it. We recognize that the police aren't solving it. We have an obligation to each other and our future generations to produce a better world than the one that we inherited. And I'm excited because it is the work of these young activists, both locally, especially nationally, who are getting that work done, who are pushing the needle forward, who are educating and demanding a more just, more equitable, and loving world. And I think that's what Black Lives Matter is really arguing for, a just and equitable and loving and caring world, not one that is rooted in punitive sort of retribution, but one that thinks about what it means to care about all of us equally.
And kind of a recalibration maybe of what we see.
But an upheaval, I wouldn't even call it a recalibration. I don't think certain structures can be recalibrated. I think certain structures have to be dismissed. I think the symbolism of taking down, the symbolism of taking down Confederate symbols speaks volumes to that. It is not enough to rebrand Beauregard to the rebel to Hey Reb. That's not going to do it. And I think UNLV's story is telling us that. We have to get rid of and put something else in. And it's not enough to have a collective group of white guys pick. We have to have a community that looks like the community pick and debate over it and argue over it and come to some sort of consensus about what this new mascot, using this as a metaphor, what this new world might therefore look like.
I appreciate the time. It's good to meet you for the first time. I appreciate it.
No doubt. I'm always available.
Good deal. Hey, so actually, speaking of that, I'm going to stop recording.